Okay. It's not easy. Yeah. It's test. So big. I have a few paragraphs that é o número maybe later. Yeah. Cada um. É. Sim. Yes. 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 That's what it's on. Can I use? Yes. Yes. Talvez eu tivesse como cagar. É mais para nessa tree or também big. Maybe você shares. Yeah. Yeah, it was last year of something was maybe two, maybe only I can check. Actually, curious. Yeah, many years. So yeah, possibly. I was in coffee. I thought I was não foi jovem. Mas você é da leitura? Você tem não. Não. A fala de lição. Mais de lição. Eu acho que a notícia quantidade dos essa área uma também. Boa tarde, pessoal. Boa tarde. Estou falando assim, me ouvir? Sim. Vou pedir licença para a nossas convidadas. Infelizmente, a gente não tem tradução simultânea hoje, mas qualquer questão que diz respeito à língua e tradução, e à expressão, então, good afternoon to our guests. We are very excited to welcome both Azte and Z here with us. This dialogue was originally planned with BPC, the Brits Policy Center, with support of one of its centers of research, which is GSOM, for Global South. We have a number of people here involved in the center that can speak a bit more to this. I have the honor and the pleasure of being able to introduce our two guests who will complement and situate themselves and how their research is developed and brought them here for us to speak today about the possibilities of global South dialogues, including questions of resistance, space, and sovereignty. Before getting into the content of our talk, I wanted to share a bit with you the process of making possible this space of dialogue, because I think the process is also very pedagogical, not only the new and exciting concepts that our colleagues will bring from different traditions of critical thought. Yeah, so speaking very personally, I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Azadeh since 2021. We're trying to do the math, but always on the screen. And I think that's interesting, to bring this to life, because we oftentimes will try and create space of dialogue. We'll do it through the internet, we'll do it through Zoom, and we don't always have the possibility of seeing these networks come to life. And so today, it's very exciting to be able to meet off the screen and to see how transnational networks can be built, oftentimes with small gestures that eventually make possible the creation of real lived connection and dialogue. And in a similar spirit, Z has been interwoven into a number of different networks. Those of you here who have been with the Institute of International Relations for some time will no doubt know Nizam Misari is a very cherished professor and leader here of our community, very respected. And it was through these networks that we had the great pleasure of getting to know Z, who is now with us at the BPC Center as a fellow. So I wanted to bring a bit this process so that we can think through not only the substance, but the form of what our two guests have to bring in today, so that we can think about what kind of work needs to be done to make possible global subjects. And with that, I will introduce our first guest, Azadeh Sabat, who is currently a postdoctoral at the Queen's University of Belfast. And she will speak to a little bit her very rich trajectories of research and activism that no doubt have a lot to teach us here. And after passing the word for about 10-15 minutes for Azadeh to situate a bit her trajectories and her research, I'll pass the word to Z, who is currently a professor at the African Institute at the Global Studies University, who will be with us here in BBC. And it was very exciting when we saw our different timings collide, that our two guests would be physically here in Rio in the same time. We noticed that there was a connection between a lot of work that's being done. And one of the main ones that we found, he actually was the one he pointed out, is around the conception of herbicide and how we think the multiple manifestations of genocide and resistance. We here, speaking from a Brazilian context, no doubt have a lot to learn and contribute to this conversation, understanding that our country was founded on genocidal and colonial violence, specifically against indigenous and African peoples. And so here's an opportunity for us as well to learn how people in different parts of the world think through and respond to colonial and state violence. So with that, I'll pass the word to Azadeh to get us started.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's such a pleasure and honor to be with you here today. I'm Azadeh Sabat. I'm an Iranian scholar, feminist, and activist, currently based in Belfast, North Ireland. I'm working at the intersection of herbicide, genocide, post-war reconstruction, and justice. And what I would like to talk today about how I understand the relationship between these experiences and what it can bring us to see how the genocide and genocide is unfolding, herbicide, stomicide, ecocide, domicide, how all of these are so interesting. In my work, I have been particularly interested in herbicide. Herbicide initially was termed by the Bosnian architects in Mostar during 1990s, when Serbian army was destroying Bosnian cities. Between 60 to 90% of cities in Bosnia were destroyed. And the Bosnian architects realized they need a new terminology to be able to explain what is happening in Bosnian cities. Because what was happening was not a byproduct of war. It was completely designed. It was not a collateral damage. In other way, destruction was by design. It was an accidental. And the term herbicide comes from that trajectory, which means deliberate destruction of the environment. And Bosnian architects started talking about it as a form of political violence on its own term. Therefore, gave it a new language, a new name. And today we see how herbicide continues to be the tool of genocide. Palestine, for example, in southern Lebanon, southern Lebanese villages have been completely uprooted and destroyed. Villages like 1,000 years. And the relationship between herbicide and genocide is so important to understand, but also because it allows us to understand reconstruction in the post-genocide context should move beyond technical recovery. It should be able to engage with the process of transformative justice. In other way, process of reconstruction should not be physically build cities, but also should enable communities who have survived genocide to reclaim their presence, reclaim their memories, reclaim their histories. And this is a kind of a personal project for me over the past 10 years, where I started with Bosnia, and then I went to Palestinian camps in Lebanon. And I've been building on that, unfortunately, with what has happened in Gaza. I have been following the work of Palestinian architects and planners, trying to understand how do cities after genocides should be built, and who has a say in building those cities. So the topic of my speech today is genocide, herbicide, and the politics of word making. I would like to begin with a proposition that sits at the center of my speech. Genocide is also a special project. Noah Arakat, Palestinian human rights scholar and feminist, reminds us that the violence we are witnessing is not only about the number of dead, it is also about destruction of places, communities, memories, relationships, learning environments, histories, and possible futures. Violence targets not only bodies, but also infrastructures that sustain collective life. This is why I find the concept of herbicide so important. Across Palestine and Lebanon, violence is directed against homes, neighborhoods, universities, public spaces, cultural heritage, landscapes, and the material conditions through which communities reproduce. The destruction of space is therefore not a collateral damage. It is often central to the political project of genocide. A decolonial approach requires the framing of herbicide as a moment of war, which is not an exceptional humanitarian practices or a temporary breakdown of urban order, but rather a long political strategy aimed at dismantling indigenous urban life, foreclosing regional indigenous systems, and replacing one spatial order by the other, replacing the spatial order of indigenous communities by the new spatial order of settlers. My key proposition is that in Palestine, herbicide, just like Bosnia, is not a byproduct of conflict, but a constitutive mechanism of settler colonialism. From this perspective, Gaza cannot be understood as an isolated inspection. What's happening in Gaza must be situated within a longer history that began before 1948 and continues through village destructions, territorial fragmentation, planning exclusion, infrastructural violence, home demolitions, and the systemic denial of return of Palestinians to their home. So all of these compromise the act of Airside. Airside here is a technology through which indigenous presence is managed, fragmented, erased, and replaced. This raises a broader question. How should we understand reconstruction under such conditions? Too often, reconstruction is presented as a humanitarian issue, as a technical challenge. It is reduced to engineering, to housing provision, to planning, to infrastructural repair. Yet, reconstruction is never neutral. Reconstruction raises fundamental questions. Like what? Who returns? Who belongs? Whose memories are preserved in the post-genocide moment? Whose histories are erased through the act of reconstruction? What futures are being rebuilt? Across Palestine and Lebanon, what we see in the everyday efforts of communities is that rebuilding is not merely an act of physical reconstruction. It is a political project that challenges elimination, re-narrates identity, and restores the condition of life. Against projects of airicide, asphyxicide, domicide, and extenside, Palestinian and Lebanese communities mobilize architecture. They mobilize memory, mobilize oral history, and grasp special practices to reclaim existence. This is why I find the notion of reconstruction connected to world making. Making a new world which is built on the indigenous connection to land and indigenous connection to the universe. Rebuilding here is not a mere technical recovery. It is a refusal of elimination, a reclamation of indigenous space, and the reconstruction of futures that violence sought to erase. Through repair, oral history, performance, mapping, and everyday acts of placemaking, Palestinians in Gaza continue to explore the possibility of world making while living under restriction. This is also where I see an important contribution emerging from architects, urban planners, city makers in both Palestine and Lebanon. One of the interesting projects that you might like to check is Beirut Urban Lab. Beirut Urban Lab in the past few years has initiated a very interesting project of cartographies of airicide by documenting the destruction of neighborhoods in Lebanon and in Palestine. They are resisting the elimination of memories and histories of indigenous people who have lived in those spaces. They are using mapping as a tool for justice and as a way to shape more equitable futures. Their work reminds us that maps are never neutral. Maps can expose structures of domination, but they can also support struggles for return, for recovery, and for social justice. Another important effort which has been done by Palestinian and Lebanese scholars is to refuse the perpetrator language. What do I mean by perpetrator language? For example, the term ethnic cleansing. The history of the term ethnic cleansing came from Bosnian genocide. When Bosnian communities were experiencing genocide and their cities were being destroyed, Serbian army used the term ethnic cleansing in Serbia for the very first time. It was a term to cover the reality of genocide. They wanted to pretend it wasn't genocide. It was some administrative effort to transport and transfer communities. So in a way, the language was serving the political project of genocide while they were hiding it was genocide. And you often hear from Bosnian scholars how the term ethnic cleansing is a colonial term. And why you should not use that for Palestinians as well. Because it hides the logic behind what is happening. It gives a pretext as if what is happening is not a genocide, it's just transferring people from here to there. So language does not merely describe space, it produces a spatial reality. And terminology is therefore not innocent. It is infrastructural. To refuse perpetrator language is to refuse a spatial group that such language sustains. Palestinians teach us that naming genocide, naming settler colonialism, and naming herbicide becomes a political act in their own rights. Here in Brazil, we should always go back to the question of indigenous resistance. And I appreciate the indigenous struggles over centuries, over sovereignty, building relationship to land, and practice of survival under continuous elimination. These questions remain central to our work. How do indigenous communities preserve memory when archives are destroyed? How do they maintain presence when return to the indigenous land is foreclosed? How do they rebuild social groups amid ongoing project of genocide? And we should ask ourselves, how do reconstruction, mapping, memory, and everyday spatial practices can become forms of resistance? Across Palestine and Lebanon, reconstruction reveals how communities continue to create life at the very moment of genocide. They do not wait for the post-genocide. They are already rebuilding, reconstructing, because that's part of the very act of indigenous resistance. Indigenous claim to presence. And let us remember, to build again is to insist that we are still here. Thank you. Ready? Ask the word for easy.
All right. Well, it's quite a challenge to come after Azadeh. So, well, first, thank you everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. I am very grateful for Andrea, for Naira, for Marta, for Leah, for helping me come here. I'm honored to be accepted as a fellow at CBC. So this is really great, and especially also to have this chance to be in dialogue with Azadeh, because your work is so inspiring, and also because also I'm a Moroccan based in the UAE, and I'm close to Iran, but unfortunately very far, right? So it's also very ironic that actually it's a place like this that gives me an opportunity to speak to a scholar in which we have so much, we have in common, right? Sure. So really this is special, and thank you. So for here, what I want to talk about, it's also about this maybe a side in the sense of state violence. So I would like to present a research article that I published with my co-author, Augusto Delgado Palacios. So it's an investigation on the state in the global south and the tactics of managing asymmetric power with the global north. Specifically, this is the case of the Spanish-Moroccan relation, here seeing Morocco as the global south, Spain as the global north, and the instrumentalization of securitization of the border, drawing from, again, honoring Lebanon, the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies. It's a school that has actually reflected experience of scholars in war. So I'll try to just speak also a bit about the school, and I'll cite also the work of Garoupla 2025 on herbicide. So here also trying to make a link with that is in Syria. So as an inspiration for how the Moroccan state used migrants and its colonial claim on the Sahara. So growing up in Morocco, close to the northern parts, like many of my compatriots, I'm very familiar with the crossing, Spanish-Moroccan border, and also seen it as sort of a place where you have a desire, right, to get away. It's also an interesting border in some aspects. It has one of the largest GDP per capita differentials. It's actually bigger than US-Mexico, this one. So it sort of shows that confrontation of global north, global south. It's also one of former colony to former colonial power, and vice versa. Right? It's also where two very unequal, in many measurements, continents meet, Europe and Africa. The two closest points in the Strait of Gibraltar are 8 miles away, 11 kilometers away. So actually you can see Europe, you can see Africa. And you have a host of here little islands that's actually are closer to the Moroccan side, but that's our Spanish territories. And back in 2021, so this was the time where the thinking about this study, this research started. So I met with Augusto, my co-author, in Rabat. So he's a Spanish scholar, was visiting Morocco. And we were witnessing this sort of intensifying of the Spanish-Moroccan border crisis. It started already for some time, and it was getting really tense. So for a bit of context, back in 2018, Morocco unilaterally closed the land border on Ceuta, one of the Spanish enclaves. The justification was to fight contraband right? And really what it was about, it was sort of pressuring Spain to support Morocco's claim on Western Sahara. The reason that was the strategy is because actually Spain has a very, very important role here. It was the former colonial power, and it never clearly settled out, right? So it remained ambiguous, right? So it's, of course, here the onus is on them. From the Moroccan side. And also what's happened here with this closure, it was really an asphyxiation, economic asphyxiation of Ceuta and the populations living there, right? To pretty much completely isolate them. Then came 2020, 2 years later, the world was in lockdown. And Morocco sort of took advantage of that moment and tightened sort of the mobility restrictions specifically on Spain, right? So when we opened up with other countries, there was sort of the exception Spain, and this concerns both maritime and land connections. Thank you. So despite the border closure in May 2021, 10,000, so this is an enclave, so maybe go to the next one. Yeah. So here we have a view from the Moroccan side. The other side is Ceuta, and actually the little township here is called Ledoc. And in May 2021, at the height of this crisis, 10,000 migrants came into Spain through this border, and the sort of here background is that the police from the Moroccan side usually controls, but sort of they purposefully did it. So sort of they did it in a way on purpose. And this incident turned into a serious diplomatic crisis between the two countries. You may ask why this particular timing. There was a reason. So the reason was that there is this Polisario Front leader, right? So this is the group that claims independence from the independence of Western Sahara. Their leader, Brahim Ghali, had been sick, and he was accepted for medical care in Spain against the complaining of Morocco that wanted to arrest him. So because Spain did not cooperate, so this was sort of the tit for tat, right? Again, also this time, this came at an interesting moment where maybe the Moroccan state was feeling sort of empowered or emboldened, because right at that time, this was when there was the signing of the Abrahamic Accord, right, in December 2021, where Trump recognized the Moroccan claim on Western Sahara in exchange, right, for Morocco's recognition of Israel. And from that moment, Morocco intensified the pressure on Spain and other EU member states, such as Germany, in order to continuously get more recognition of its sovereignty over the territory. From the 10,000 migrants that were pushed, 7,000 were deported back to Morocco. A large part of them swam across the Sis Tarajal beach in Ceuta, and many of them were minors. The Spanish justice system had recently stopped the expulsion of minors, being against EU law and Spanish legislation. So what happened was that for many weeks, these younger people were sleeping on the streets, and some were subjected to legal pushback practices to sort of go on the other side of the border. In response, the European Parliament issued a resolution condemning the instrumental use of children as a political weapon by Morocco, and this provoked a response from the Moroccan Parliament, which rejected it and branded it as interfering, and that actually Ceuta, Melilla, the Canary Islands are colonial territories, that they should be Moroccan. Now stepping back, a little early, sorry. I want to tell you a bit about the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies as a useful lens here to understand this instrumentalization of the border crisis. And this is more than your standard securitization, right? So you take something that is not necessarily a security matter and you make it one, right? This is what we have in that theory. But here, what we are trying to do is pay attention to the self-reproducing mechanisms of security, how they reproduce. It also sees that insecurity can come from multiple actors, right? And most importantly, it asks the question of security for whom, which then means security at the cost of whom. The school emerged from the scholars who were in Lebanon also at a time where Israel was bombing the country in the name of security. Again, happened repeatedly. So it is about situated knowledge, right? And revealing how securitization is a mechanism to sustain violence. So with Augusto, we find that this lens is particularly helpful because we saw that in the case of this crisis between Morocco and Spain, there was a tactic to sort of sacrifice minors, children, in the name of fighting the threats of Spain in its nonchalance regarding recognizing the Moroccan claim of Western Sahara hasn't been acted, right? So, as I mentioned, we were inspired by the work of Garoun Pla, so who has been also using operationalizing the Beirut School as a method to sort of observe security in context. And he looked at herbicide in Syria during the Assad's war against the militarized opposition in 2018, which demonstrated how the Assad regime instrumentalized the terrorist framing prevalent since the global war on terror, right? Where you claim that an opponent is a terrorist, right? And that sort of catapults, right, the gravity, right, of their violence that then justifies another violence. Like Assad's herbicide, Morocco could be charged with youthcide, right, in the name of protecting national interests. So now back to the Spain-Morocco border crisis. Well, it's the last one, sorry, thank you. Well, it reveals the intermingling between issues of inequality, right? So here thinking about income per capita, including asymmetric power, and also claims of dignity and identity. So the border since 2018 had remained closed until 2025, so just last year it reopened. So that was really a long closure. The smuggling activities, because of this very long closure, the smuggling activities of that crossing have really dramatically decreased. It has very much impacted the economies of Ceuta and Melilla, the two enclaves. It's also meant the loss of employment of approximately 7,000 Moroccan porters, especially women, pejoratively called mujeres mulas, right? Because they are holding very large bags. This has provoked locally some protests and mobilization. the Moroccan government has launched in response a number of programs of reintegration of these women, notably in the agribusiness sector, which is very low paying and often a precarious job. At the same time, the country is celebrating its victories in gaining international recognition of its territorial claim and also winning the next bid of the World Cup, right? Especially again with this sort of tense relation with Spain. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zizi. I confess I'm very touched by this opening that you made for us about how we can create these spaces of dialogue and how far you had to come in order to be able to come into this dialogue. So to begin amplifying the possibilities of this conversation, I'm here with the task of trying to bring out as well some possible connections and disconnections, ways that we can learn from these various experiences. And listening to both of you, something that became very apparent is this necessity to recenter our lens from what's, as I mentioned, was the perpetrator lens or the perpetrator language, and the ways in which Z brings the lens of the behavior critical security school to go beyond secularization, to me, is one possibility for us to think through. Because when we reduce political, social, economic questions, dynamics, conflicts to responding to a securitized framing, we are in a way taking on and looking at a problem through the perpetrator lens. And then the resistance also means that the object of our claims and our reivindications will always be the state. Yeah, and we kind of get stuck in this seeing the world through the eyes of this state. So I think there's such a strong invitation, both of your talks, to sort of recenter this this way of looking at things. And the language of Earthside that you both bring, I think, has a lot to contribute to our conversations here in this. Yeah, I think a number of people here in the public can share how the reivindication of the category of genocide has been central for both Indigenous and African movements in Brazil. We have a number of references, such as Abdias do Nascimento, that in the post-war period went to these international spaces to denounce and give this name, genocide, specifically in terms of the kind of violence subjected to African populations in Brazil. And one of the big challenges that came in this process is that the lens of genocide that the international community recognized is a kind of genocide based on the experience of the Holocaust, based on a very particular experience that is able to capture certain dynamics and not others. So I think this invitation that you both made to think through herbicide, I think opens space for us to take this conversation to another place, that pays attention to what Andrea was saying is the material conditions for the reproduction of life. That's a very situated, not at all abstract way of thinking about both the colonial violence and the possibilities of resistance and possibilities of identifying other sites of resistance beyond this perpetual move to seek recognition from the state. Yeah? So I think in that way, I'll open the conversation here. I know there's a lot of people here with different research agendas that might cross with a lot of what was brought here from the idea of settler colonialism and genocide to the role of infrastructure in processes of reconstruction, how we think through the problem of security. Yeah, with the GSOM, there's a lot of very critical work being done around rethinking our lens of security. I'll just check in with our hosts around how much time we have, more or less. An hour? So we have time to converse. I love it because I'm no good at the time of the watch. So you can open up, maybe take 3 initial questions, comments, provocations, and then sort of take it back to our guests. So feel free as well to intervene as you see. And I'm here as well with this translation.
Good afternoon. My name is Nemo Farias. I was approved for the master's in analysis in marketing. It's marketing. It's a big name. And I understand that genocide is a big problem is in Bosnia and Palestine. And you say that there is one problem in language. And I would like to know if the principal problem of genocide in Palestine, Bosnia, the principal problem to commit genocide in Bosnia, and how the government build the politics of construct people, reconstruct families from families that belongs to peoples, the group of peoples that were the victim of genocide. Okay? And another question is about Marrocos. Marrocos, I understand that Marrocos. I understand more or less about Marrocos. I saw some films. Marrocos is a cool country. In your presentation, you saw that there is a big problem about migration. And the migration to Spanish is the problem. And what's the principal problem of migration in Marrocos? Is poverty or the poverty or just a picture? Em português, porque Marrocos ali pobreza, porque assim, eles migram. Que ela mostra ali, eles migrando, ganhou a questão da pobreza. Assim, direitos humanos. The principal problem is focused to immigrate to another country. Yes.
Okay. Opportunity. So, I mean,
Okay. Right. And I sometimes I saw film that took place in Marrocos, and I saw that the migration to Marrocos took place too. And these problems unemployed people, and they need to find work in French and stuff.
Obrigada. Sigaríamos, achei eu me. Também quem preferir fazer eu sei que
Tem uma curiosa.
Very, very, very quick. It's dynamic. So I learned a lot about Celtic and Mila and European studies, and European authors. They speak about these islands as non-European Europe. This is a term they coined in order to openly say they are ultramarine territories, ex-colonies. They are very open saying that. So at the same time, they say non-European is to fix the border, but Europe in order to control. Yeah. And the main actor for me in this language, that's the question I want to hear from you, your opinion. Through the Beirut critical studies, I'm not from this school, but it's interesting to hear the role of Frontex, the role of the European Union on this, yeah? Because Frontex, for the ones that don't know very good, is the border control actor of the European Union itself. So it's not a Spanish border control actor, it's the EU, but they are paying Moroccan people as buffer actors, right? To secure this control on behalf of Europe. So they don't want to dirty their hands. So I want to hear from you, because this is what gets to us. They don't want to dirty their hands, so they pay Morocco, as they pay Turkish people as well, to be buffers, to continue there, so to kill their own people, because it's Morocco killing Morocco. Yeah, and others, of course, on behalf of Europe, on behalf of Spain, but even worse for me, on behalf of Europe, because it's the EU. Frontex is from the EU. After that 2016, the Syrian crisis, they more than triplicate the budget for Frontex. Frontex was nothing before this, and nowadays it's a big structure of border control, surveillance so far. So I want to hear updated information. If you have the role of EU on this thing, because and for you, of course, the role of NATO and the UN in the language of epistemic in Bosnia. As everybody here, we have a very good friend working on this topic for a long time. And this is a remaining question I make for her. What's the language of epistemic when it speaks from these international actors, some struggle going so there? Absolutely. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Hello, my name is Nayara. I'm a master's student here, and I'm studying the Mediterranean Central Road, especially the relation between Libya and Italy. So I understand this road as a new way of colonial order, when we think about pushbacks and all the violence that comes to be happening in Libya, in Syria. And I want to know your opinion and how this book will explain the pushbacks. I don't know how it's going to happen. It's happening actually in Morocco, but we know that there's a lot of death rates in this route between Libya and Italy, and a lot of anonymization acts. And I interpret the pushbacks as continuous act of anonymization of black bodies. So I want to know.
The principal problem is Hubert or Harris.
Okay. Shall we take back? So conversation back here.
I think maybe we respond to the first round, and then go for it. Yeah, I found the connection between the question and their question. I'm not sure I exactly got your question. You asked if certain communities were genocided in Bosnia and what happened to them. Can you clarify?
Yeah, I understand that there is a lot of. What's the principal problem of genocide mostly? Okay, how they construct the families that belongs to people who did genocide, who did death. Second, principal motivos que não, mas atualmente
a gente usa de termo genocídio sempre passam nele.
Mas genocídio é instituição do grupo, eu entendo como genocídio.
Nós temos, como a Andréia trouxe, a gente trabalha com, possível trabalhar com a categoria de genocídio para pensar a violência do Estado Essa ocupação do Brasil contemporaneamente. Sim, esse contemporâneo, mas atualmente no Brasil ele não veio falar com sim, houve muito, sim. Eu também não é um assunto que eu sei que é mãe, a noção dessa ideologia,
very white genocide occurred in Bosnia after the collapse of former Yugoslavia. I mean, it's also very interesting to look at the post-World War, Cold War era politics, because former Yugoslavia was a very powerful socialist country. And the US and the Western power didn't want a powerful country, Balkan. They were trying their best to disintegrate Balkans. Like what they did in Syria, what they tried to do in Iraq, what they want to do in Iran. They were trying to disintegrate all these strong powers that can be challenging the hegemony of Western imperialism. So I can say that one of the reasons of the collapse of the Balkans and the former Yugoslavia was this Western power interferences. So the countries in Balkans were divided into different nation states, like Albania, Serbia, Croatia, different countries became independent. But when Bosnia became independent, the Serbian army threatened that if this country becomes independent, we are going to destroy the politics of the government and destroy people. And the reason was that Serbia was interested to annex Bosnia to its own territories, to create a greater Serbia, like greater Israel. So there was the Greater Serbia project, which was only possible if Serbia was annexing parts of Bosnia. But here there was a problem. Bosnia was a multiracial country, with the Muslims being its majority, like Bosniak, or the Bosnian Muslims were the majority, and then after them were Serbians and Orthodox, and then Croats and Christians, Muslim Catholics. So the civil war which started wasn't really an equal war between the different sides. It was aimed at genociding the Bosnian Muslims to be able to own the land. Always remember, genocide is connected to the land. Genocide happens because the perpetrators, the colonizers, the settlers, after the Greater Serbia, Greater Israel project, they want to annex the land. So that was the reason the genocide was. But the way the international community used the perpetrator language to fight the genocide is very important. Because you only hear about genocide about what happened in Srebrenica. Yeah. As if genocide just happened in that very spot. Genocide was a political project. It was happening everywhere. But the international community treated it as if, oh, it was a one accident, the wrong accident. It just suddenly happened somewhere. I mean, city of Sarajevo survived the longest siege in the contemporary war, like 3 years of siege. I mean, siege in international law is a form of genocide. I mean, you put an entire population under siege, you don't allow them to have access to basic needs. So that's a form of genocide. The Gaza, for the last 16 years, before 7th of October, there was already genocide, but nobody was recognizing it as a genocide had started, you know. So that language is again very important, how genocide became, oh, what is happening in Srebrenica. I mean, if you go to Bosnia, you will see mass graves in many parts of the country that are unknown because the international community only heard about Srebrenica. They didn't hear about other places. And it might be important to know why international community heard about genocide in Srebrenica. Because of the mothers of Srebrenica. If it wasn't for the struggles of mothers of Srebrenica, the genocide in Srebrenica could have been forgotten like yesterday. When the bodies of the disappeared, particularly the men and the sons and the husbands of these women, were destroyed. You know the way Serbians used to treat the bodies? They would destroy the bodies, so the body wasn't integrated to be able to bury in one place. You would find an arm somewhere, you would find a feet somewhere else, you would find a head somewhere else, so people couldn't identify even their own body to be able to get a dignified burial. So these mothers used to go around and try to find the bodies of their loved ones. And they were staying in the space the genocide happened. Srebrenica, that UN headquarters where the genocide happened. And they stayed there for months and months. They protested. And they say that that space needs to be converted into Srebrenica Memorial. And that's why there's a Srebrenica Memorial. It wasn't because the government was just kind enough to come and give these people a memorial project. It wasn't. It was because of those mothers. And there is something also very important to remember. After the genocide happened, that place, the Serbians were throwing their garbages and their trashes. They were trying their best to kind of completely undermine that space. Because the space had witnessed genocide. It was a witness to what had happened. That land had witnessed them. I went there last year for the 50th anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica. And before going, because it's a very small town, village really, and after the genocide, the population never came back to what it was before the genocide. Because it was completely empty of Bosniaks. Maybe, 10,000 people from Bosniak community were able to return. What happened after the genocide, maybe a question, the governance of the area where the genocide happened was offered to Serbs. So basically, you genocide the entire population, you took their lands, and then you also get the reward. So who owns and who governs is called Republic of Srebrenica. Yeah. So the Bosniaks went back to their lands. That's why I say the question of who returns, who belongs, whose memories has the right to preserve. Because that's exactly what happened to Srebrenica. So, I just give you a very interesting example. I was trying to find, a guest house to stay for 2 nights when I went there. And I was on different booking.com and these things because you can't really find hotel. And every house I found for tourists, they would ask you a question. What is the reason of your visiting Srebrenica? And I was just writing, in my own mind, I just want to go to the memorial for the 30th anniversary. And then, and then I was like, what's happening? I asked a Muslim friend, I'm trying to find a place, everyone rejects me. And then she told me, did they ask you why you're going? So yeah, I told them, I'm going for memorial. So, did you think you're very cool to explain? Those are Serbs. The people who own all those lands are Serbs, and they don't want somebody who goes there and attend memorial. So we ended up finding a Muslim woman who gave us a room, 5 of us were living in a room. And on the day of memorial, we walk from the city center to the memorial genocide, where they are bringing new bodies that they have identified. You would see all the photos of Serbian commanders on the walls. They are the heroes. And then these people have been genocided 13 years later. I mean, there's not even a denial. They think it was a heroic act, you know? So I think the word failed Srebrenica. That's why genocide is happening in Gaza. The word failed Srebrenica, and exactly what happened in Srebrenica continued in. I mean, when you look at the history of what happened in Srebrenica, like I interviewed with few of the survivors of men, because the majority of people who were genocided were men. And I spoke to few men who were survivors, and they told me, like, out of 10,000 men who had fled, maybe only 4 or 5 had escaped. And those 4 or 5 were the men who didn't trust UN promises. All other trusted that UN will protect them. They went to the UN headquarters. They all were genocided. These 3-4 people didn't trust UN. They escaped through jungle. So the only men who survived Srebrenica were the men who didn't trust UN. Doesn't say something? Yeah. The international law and all these illusions. Sorry, I spoke too long, but I think what happened in Bosnia really needs to be heard again and again. It's really shocking, like how we really don't know what happened in Bosnia and what's happening now in Palestine. Yeah.
Brings a much broader way of looking at what we supposed. Yeah. True. So much.
Actually, I'd like also to sort of underline the point you made. So I just want to also mention a few things about the case of Bosnia, because you inspired me actually to go recently. So just before coming here, I was at a conference in Sarajevo, and it was very revealing because growing up, of course, we watched on TV the siege.
Yeah.
And that's part of seeing how, I mean, when you mentioned how Mostar, right, which is in Herzegovina, how this was where the term herbicide started. So I thought that was really something, I found very interesting, because you also see, for example, in Sarajevo, how, of course, the city, the mortar, impact, the bullets everywhere. So it's very visible, and you see that resilience of the city. So it's very marking. And also on the point of how Ceuta and Melilla are sort of, Europe. In this conference, we were talking about how Balkans are sort of Europeans, right? And to speak also to the point about, why genocide happened. And there is that clear also aspect of religion, right? So when you have Europeans that happen to be Muslims, where do you put them?
They're not European anymore.
Exactly, not right? So I think those aspects are very important. And there were discussions about these scholars from the Balkans. Some were actually also come from Belgrade, and they were really talking about, and it was really interesting to witness.
Yeah.
So going back to maybe trying and addresses some of the questions. And congratulations on the masters. So migration, I mean, I think in the case of Morocco, you that aspect of violence and or poverty. So I think poverty is also a form of economic violence, right? So you have maybe a bodily safety violence with the maybe when you have conflicts or when you have different armed groups, right? But in the case of Morocco, there are a number of characteristics that are also regional. So, for example, being part of the Middle East, North Africa region, so it is Middle East, it's also the African continent, right? So it's sort of imbricated in two, right, regions. So remember the Arab Spring 2011, right? When we had the young people revolts. Of course, now we look at it with different perspective, but it was the unemployment of the youth, right? And you have in the region, of course, the continent, the African continent, is the youngest continent, right? In terms of the younger people. So you have a lot of young people, right? You have a competition on resources, limited resources. Of course, it comes with the then corrupted networks, right? And then you have this very vulnerable, precarious sort of environment for young people who are desperate to leave, right? So that's I think the economic aspect is quite strong. But of course, for example, in the case of Morocco, there aren't sort of, conflicts, but of course there is the Sahel, right? Just south of Morocco, where they cross, right, through Morocco to go to Europe, right? So in the case of Morocco, it's more the poverty to respond. And also just for the notes, to see the scale also of how actually young the population is. So in 2011, from 2011 to now, so 15 years, the population rose more than 20%. 20%. That's very sizable. There isn't enough actually economic growth, right? So there is a mismatch. There isn't enough growth for the growth of population. So that also explains that aspect of actually growing inequalities.
I think that it's from the undeveloped country because in Brazil, in some states of the northwest of Brazil, in the past, the poverty is a big problem, and a big problem. And the country was developing and reduce the poverty and the people. And if you compare this country, Morocco, for example, it seems Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard the comparisons.
Okay.
I think you have also in the case of Morocco, for example, again, economy. So for example, here in Brazil, a number of also global South countries, we still have more industry, right? Mm-hmm. So industry. So this is something that's where, for example, in the African continent, is still a problem. Is that it's not industrial enough. Right? So it's more agricultural based, far more rural, right? So it creates that sort of differential. Sometimes, yes. Sorry. Yes. So actually, that's point. So on why, yes, it is different. So for example, when we used to cross, on the passport, when you go to the enclaves, they don't stamp. Right? You stamp only when you go to the mainland of Spain, right? Part of it is because it's also not Schengen. So the enclaves are not Schengen.
But Spain is.
Spain, yes, but they're not. And part of the reason they're not Schengen is also because they're not in the tax zone. So they are tax-free, right? So that sort of compensates, right, for their lack of contribution, right? Is that they also don't get all the privileges of the EU, right? Because there are sort of these zones with special conditions. But there are attempts in Europe to actually further externalize, because technically right now that's point of Frontex it's an externalization of the European border, right? You give it to the third parties, right? And these third parties are non-Europeans, so of course you can get away from the conditionalities, right? So including, for example, on that point of the expulsion of minors, right? So there was legal battles, and actually to the credit of Spain, a number of activist organizations were able to sue the Spanish government for expulsing these young people, right? And they used European law, right? And saying, okay, it's the enclaves, it's not completely Europe, but still, and the judgment sort of went in their favor. So there are gray zones, there are attempts, there are some groups that would like them to sort of fully sort of Schengen Europe. But I think that's it's not strong enough. I think there are definitely, there is sort of an uneasiness about Frontex, but at the same time, I think the stakes are not high enough, to actually really do something about, let's say, a better management, right, of these borders. For example, the Turkish EU refugee deal, right, of 2016. It's I think and you have even someone like Angela Merkel, right? Back then used to be sort of pro-migration and definitely changed. And of course now if you look at the politics in Europe, it's not going into like necessarily improving, right, on these migration questions, on the management of borders. And there were a number of stampedes, so the violence is real. I mean, for example, this episode of the expulsion of expulsion of the minors, that was very, you could see it, but there were a number of stampedes, and that's very hard to actually track. So both from the Spanish media and from the Moroccan media, right? There is a sort of censorship on that, and of people trying to actually climb there is a wall. So we have a wall before Trump's wall between actually we have two walls. There are two walls, the Moroccan wall and the Spanish wall, and the people have been trying to climb it, and they've been stampeded, they've been a bit deaths. So part of the logic of closing was also to sort of bury a bit this problem, right, of the borders. And regarding the Libya-Italy sort of connection in terms of how it is, also an aspect of that problematic relationship with former colonial colony dynamic. It's absolutely. Even again going back to 2011, right, with the NATO intervention in Libya, fall of Gaddafi, right? Libya, Italy specifically didn't join NATO, right? So it was sort of almost like that's our Gaddafi, right? Because of course gas, right? So Italy has very much benefited from Libyan gas, and I think it has sustained that relationship between the two countries because it's economical, right? It has to sort of sustain now in the post-Gaddafi Libya as a way of Italy not also hiding the problem, right? That has become now also a problem of trafficking, right? Actually these routes, right, of migration that go through the country. I don't know what can improve that. I think it's a little worse than Morocco because again here it's also sort of compounded, right, with actually armed groups that are on the ground. So the human trafficking, not to say that they are not also subjected to violence by the police. In the case of Morocco, actually both police. Yeah, so I don't know if I address.
It's a difficult question. I'm trying to explain it. Sensation.
Is either we can open up for another round of this conversation questions. Yes, we have it to 6, is that right? Yeah. I saw a two hands. Yes. Alexandre, Yasmini, Chas. Yeah.
So in the new, like to ask you, you think culture has an important role in as an antidote is the Vivian genocide, the genocide, and just to propose to see this as native relations by other points of view. I'm asking that because I teach international relations here. We use African literature as a way to feed the debate. I just give the students some chapters of African writers' books, so we can discuss the theory and do it through what the literature brings us in a more humanitarian way. So we read by Hijab Sheikh, some Somali writer. She proposed reconstruction of Mogadishu through her memories and the memories of the father and mother, cousin, brother, which does not exist anymore. It's made by their childhood memories. There's some kind of what Lucas Sombras for the state for Luanda does, and she writes a book. It's called Inês Cockroach, and she rebuilds. She brings back. She turns her book as an archive. The memories of her family was washed up. Was the bodies. She doesn't know where it was. So she turns her book into an archive against the Libyan genocide, and she reconstructs her village was torn by the French militias. And I remember about Moroccan writer, this Laila Lalami. She wrote a book that's Hope, Another Dangerous Pursuits, I think. And she just talks about all of those issues that you brought us here, but from the eyes of the ordinary people. They just talk about the problems about Western Sahara and how they can bribe the fisherman just to use his boat to cross the river, how they connect those bribes, webs, just to pay the Spanish officials to choose who can enter and who can be drawn, have to be spelled. So this is it. How do you think culture is a key instrument as the living and just to propose another way to those issues?
I think we'll take a few more because it's not so that I know this question around culture is actually how we met the political role of art. I think next was Marcelo, Thiago e a Juliette on this front.
Can I go?
Yes.
Thank you very much for such inspirational speeches today. I also teach here. My research involves architecture and power and also identity. And when we talk about herbicide and the possibility of erasure after reconstruction. And when you think about many cases like the Civil War and of course Bosnia, etc., we see that this happens a lot. But when we think about Mostar and the rebuilding of the bridge, there is something there where it becomes an unintentional monument. And my question here, or my provocation is, can we, when reconstructing and preserving, can we really appease, or we create or crystallize the conflict? That is a little bit what happened when you're talking about your visit to.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, I have a more direct question to as well. Maybe connects a bit with so when I was listening about actually a lot of interesting questions, maybe how can we reconstruct, how can we do cities of the genocide, and how we can reclaim history, reclaim memories, and but the most is by living under destruction. Yeah. And that one will keep with me and stay with me for a long time. Maybe because it's what rests and what stays for it's, and also funny in the sense of destruction, I was thinking in more intimate sense, in the sense of the house, in the sense of the body, in the sense of what stays, and then what remains, and how to archive, maybe how to remain with not things but your own body, and how you can connect maybe the body with this kind of memory, and how can we think about in terms of reconstruction, and in a sense that that is connect with embodiment, and also with subjectivities that are trying to relive. Yeah, maybe it's not a question that a present now to make to try to answer now, but what I want to be more clear and to hear more is about the street and being connections between embodiment, subjectivities, and maybe revealing our vibes and so on.
It's a pleasure to meet you and to have a chance to engage in that conversation. So I'm a professor here at the Institute of International Relations, and I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at the law department. And I would like to go back to the question of the language of the perpetrator in connection with the question of politics of memory. Yeah, that is so crucial in the kind of struggles, academic, scholarly, and otherwise, that we are engaged in. So, for a little bit of context, we are involved in a project, with several partners, historians, education scholars, law scholars. We are trying to respond to a demand. That's where my question goes. I'd like to hear from you on the contribution that we can make in that sense, in the sense of developing a different language other than the language of the perpetrator, and how we can, from the academia, provide some support and bolster some sort of different language and autonomous politics of language from people, in particular communities. So one of the things we oftentimes struggle with is one, the archive, what we get from the archive, official archives, which is fundamentally in some certain cases silences, or again, the language of the perpetrator, that does not work for the kind of politics of memories we are trying to develop. So again, back to the project. We are involved in a project where we, as scholars, are responding to this demand by let's say, I don't like the term, but religious leaders from African descent in Brazil. So we are dealing with documents and lawsuits that are supposed to document one of the founding moments of Brazil as a nation state, where you have the criminal persecution of African spiritual religiosity or African spiritual practices and African spiritual leaders in Brazil. And so we are tackling with these lawsuits. Oftentimes we struggle with the archives with the question of silence. Like, you see the news from back then and you see that things happen, but when you look to the archives, you don't find the documents there. And this is a project that also involves all sorts of what we are calling here also repatriation. So we're talking about cultural artifacts that were in the possession of the state, to be more specific, of the Museum of the Police. And now they're being repatriated. So there's a lot of discussion of who's supposed to take care of the collection, because it's been taken care of by a museum, but then you're talking about the spiritual artifacts, so you need people who know how to handle them. So there's a whole debate. So again, the lenses of the perpetrator, the language of the perpetrator, and how, and this is the kind of struggle, methodological, and also because I'm trying to respond to this. What kind of narrative can we build from, the archives that speak the language of the perpetrator, the archives that are all filled with silences, and silences that we know are productive, that sustain the Brazilian states and the continuous killing of, again, predominantly male men and young men in Brazil, obviously of African descent. So, again, politics of memory is fundamental to, responding to the continued genocide of the Black population in Brazil. So back to the question, and sorry for the long, but I was trying to situate where I'm speaking from to get, involved in the conversation. So I'd like to hear from the experiences of you could share in terms of how, as scholars, we can help develop a different language. Experiences of developing different language other than the language of the perpetrator, and how to deal with silences that sustain these colonial archives, that sustain all these dynamics of genocide, genocide, abstemicide also, because this is fundamentally also about abstemicide. So I'd like to hear about your experiences in that particular area, because again, back to the research, I've been trying to work also with infrastructure, also at the symbolic level, because we know it's not only the land. I mean, the land is fundamental, obviously, but we also have all sorts of symbolic underpinnings to, that will make us able to develop our, humanities. So, I can hear from you on that. Thank you again.
One quick point about the sound.
So, my name is Fábio. There's a question about Morocco and Spain. So at the beginning of the paper, you said Spain is the Google North and Morocco is the Google South. But sometimes, and I have to tackle with this already, people say, look, Spain is the south of Europe. So I want to know how you tackle this theoretical question as to include Spain in the Google North.
Beautiful, lots of potential conversation.
Wow. I say I'm impressed with the questions and the reflections, and seriously,
It's in trouble to answer.
So feel free in the spirit of to bring out, some of these reflections around the role of culture, architecture, the archive, and the limits of so many of these categories, north, south, and others are these to preserve.
I didn't get your name. Alexander. First of all, your students are really lucky to have you, because what you're doing in a school of international relations is not common at all. You're basically decentering the knowledge by bringing those stories and histories and narratives to your classroom. And something which we really need in international relations, because it's a very colonial discipline. And what do I mean by colonial discipline? It revolves around conversations of relations between nation states, and actually relations between states, rather than relations between people. We go to international relations schools, we only hear about relations between states. So where are the people? How do people experience? How do people build their relationships? How an Iranian between with a Moroccan? I mean, I'm not allowed to go to their country. She's not allowed to come to my country. I have got several visits. Every time they realize I have Iranian passport, then, oh, sorry, we can't get your visa. I mean, and that's how all relationships have been disguised under this paradigm. And the first thing we should do is really to decolonize and decenter what we understand as knowledge. And that's very much part of the word making and epistemologies of the people, of the marginalized, rather than the Western dominant Eurocentric epistemology of the world. Because again, international vision is very much about, if you look at the syllabuses, very much about how the Western white man understood the world. Through conquest, through colonization, through empire, reconstruction. Yeah, and I come to that question because reconstruction is again very important. How reconstruction becomes continuation of the war. Reconstruction becomes another war. But in terms of culture, that knowledge, that worldview is preserved through cultural practices. And that's another important way to decolonize our land, that culture is not just a series of ritual. Because the way Western interpretation of non-Western words always understands our culture, our culture for the Western people is a series of folklore, some exotic icons, but it's not knowledge. Knowledge is just what the Western can produce. What I have is just some folklore, some ritual, some tradition. And that is the hierarchy. So when you give precedence to that culture, the first thing you do is to challenge that my culture is deep-rooted in my land, and it's deep-rooted in my language, and it's deep-rooted in my knowledge. My ancestors' knowledge, my ancestors' wisdom, the way we see our life and our world and connect ourselves to the universe and to each other. So culture is not just like this Iranian fabric and wearing, or, it's not just an icon. And that is what you're doing with your book. I mean, you're bringing those stories. And I always love this idea of Edward Said. He talks about traveling theories. Like when theories travel, for example, from, and it was always like this in the olden days, like theories will travel from India, China, to Iran, to Arab world, to North Africa, and nobody owned them. Theories were traveling, they were transformed in different contexts, they were situated, And the whole world was involved in creating it, and like before colonization started, like now the best owns all the knowledge. So by bringing African voices, basically you are decentering. You're decentering international relation, you're decolonizing the language, we understand international relation. And that is how I understand culture as challenging what culture is, what our culture is according to Western mind. And regarding genocide and reconstruction, the reason I very much became interested in reconstruction was I realized that people who become in charge of reconstruction are most often the people who actually destroyed those cities. So when you look at the case of Zionist entity, in 2014, the very last example before this recent genocide, when they destroyed Gaza over the summer, after the summer ended, the so-called war on Gaza ended, the only companies who were allowed to bring cement to United Nations were Israelis. Basically, Israel didn't allow any other country or company to sell their cements. So first they destroyed the country, the land, the people, and now they were selling cements. They were selling material for reconstruction. There is a political economy of destruction which is connected to reconstruction in every country. And in contexts where genocide happens, reconstruction continues not. And this is what happens in Srebrenica today. According to the word, there is no genocide in Srebrenica anymore. It's all peaceful. But the logic of genocide continues every day in our planning. For example, the family I was living with, they couldn't send their children to kindergarten in Srebrenica. There is no kindergarten. They couldn't send their children to school in their town. They had to go like 11 kilometers away to another town to send their child to school. And these are all systemic in order to discourage people of coming and returning to Srebrenica. Their own language of ethnic cleansing. Let's go back to the word ethnic cleansing. What do you cleanse? Why do things are dirty that should be cleansed? The land should be cleansed. This is completely colonial logic. Like you cleanse something when it's dirty, when it's uncivilized, when it's, you use it for a group of people. And the word thing it's right and continues reproducing the language and normalizing the language as if it's fine to ethnically cleanse somewhere. So, and let's go back to Mostar, that bridge. Before going to Mostar, I had read a lot about how this reconstruction of this bridge was so important in bringing diversity, in connecting people. This romantic view of now that the bridge was reconstructed, we can go back to the peaceful days we had. I went through Mostar last year. It was my second trip, but the first time I seriously started talking to people. And I asked them about what they felt about this bridge, the reconstruction, everything. Obviously, everyone was happy the bridge was rebuilt. But one of the themes which came across conversation was like the UNESCO treated the reconstruction of this bridge as if it was just an icon, a beautiful one. We had to go back and completely redesigned what had happened before. This became like a national heritage that we need to preserve. So what you mentioned about crystallizing the conflict exactly happened on that bridge. There are areas in Mostar, like for example, the west of Mostar is mostly resided by Bosniak, the east mostly resided by Croats. Croatian Croats. And you know, the people who destroyed the bridge were Croats. And the reason they destroyed it wasn't because they didn't like diversity or all these Western liberal, narratives that some scholars talk about. According to the people whom I interviewed, it was simple. They destroyed the bridge because they wanted the Bosniak Muslim population under siege. This never comes in any literature, in Western literature. And the men who fought when the siege happened, like I was speaking to one of the men who fought when he was 14-year-old, and he basically showed me the tortures and the wounds he survived. And he told me we were fighting because we were under siege. It wasn't like I was sad, I couldn't talk to my neighbor. It wasn't just that. They wanted us to surrender, and they wanted to annex the land, Croatia, because there was a rivalry. Croatia wanted part of the country annexed to Croat, and the Serbia wanted the Greater Serbia project, and the Bosnians were, middle. Now we have this segregation after the so-called genocide, and the bridge is there. There are few companies, factories in Mostar that produce chemical waste. These chemical wastes are entering the water, entering the lake. A group of population is most affected by that chemical waste. Percentage of cancer is highest among that population. Can you guess who are that population? Muslims. So when you talk about the bridge as some iconic construction, but we forget how genocide's logic continues in the post-war reconstruction every day. And when I was there, I was asking my Muslim friends, isn't any demonstration, isn't any members of community are dying of cancer and everyone knows they are Muslims, so why nobody speaks about it? And they were telling me because of the corruption in the state and because NGOs are mostly funded by international organizations, you can only talk about women's rights up to a level. But if women are under genocide, you can't talk about that. You can talk about gay rights up to a limit. But, so it also shows how international politics define the language of what is human rights and what is not. And here we come to the fact that, I think you mentioned, I forgot your name.
Ciao.
We need to find our own terms. And we need to define our problems with our own terms. The very first thing that international political discourse does in countries such as ours is pacification. Pacification so that they can control the narrative. They can own our destiny. The very first thing colonizers do is changing the names. In every country, colonizers have entered. The first thing they did was changing names. This is not accidental, because by changing the names, you create alienation between the people of that land and that land. And then you change the name of the people gradually. Then you change their language. I mean, these people are becoming strange from who they were, what they are. And all these are important in terms of political representation, it's memory, because when you forget your own past, who you were, and also you see in the form of process of resistance, like, for example, Afro-Brazilian community, like how they sustain the symbolism in architecture, for example. How they sustain symbolism in the growing plants, like a baobab or different lettuce, in front of their spaces to create a form of temple that they were denied to have, you know. So I think it's very interesting how communities resist to own their own terms and their own language. A lot of post-colonial scholarship exactly engages with that issue of archive, because colonial archive and institutional archive was designed to dismantle the indigenous people's stories and narrative. It was completely by design. When you go to a museum, you would see a lot of absences and a lot of silences, and it's not by accident. Because the storyteller tells us the way you see a people, the way you look at a people, the way you represent a people is connected to the way they are treated. If you represent Iranians, Palestinian, Lebanese as terrorists, you already decide how they should be treated. And I just want to compliment what you're doing by saying, like, you can't dismantle the master's house with master's tool. So we need to just decolonize the archive by going back to stories, to poetry, everything that the white man thinks is not knowledge. We own it, and it's our knowledge.
Thank you. I thought
Sure. And to correct the record, so for Iranians to come to Morocco, impossible almost. But actually, the other way around, it is possible. But what's interesting is that actually for Moroccans who decide to go to Iran and come back, it becomes an issue for them because they are then flagged. Like, why did you go to Iran? Okay. So that's, just for the notes. Actually for the I think the two comments, Alexander, Thiago, on sort of, I think that there is a connection about the need to use culture to fight oblivion, the need to correct the language, improve the language. And I think it's not just to, maybe deal with those silences, but sometimes it's actually to correct the record, right? So to correct the record to begin with, because maybe it's not that it's forgotten, maybe it's misrecorded. So one example, I mean, in the case of here these border problems, in the case of Spain, so it's very interesting how, to me, it's instrumentalized by the state. So I find also that looking at the states through policies is also really revealing of how much it impacts our communities in this sort of this omnipresence of the state, right? That has become a bit our time, and the fact that I think we need also to tackle it, right? Sort of to take the bull by his horns. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to, for example, look at the language of policies versus, yes, the experiences of people. In these disputes, the way actually to deal with the Frontex or these agencies, European agencies that can get more money, was to say, well, actually, we're good students, right? We are doing better than Europe. So, for example, a number of these irregular migrants have been regularized in Morocco. They've been given documentations, right? And then it's all over the news. Look at us, how great we are, right? We have given papers, and Europeans didn't, right? But in reality, actually, these people, this regularization means nothing. And there is this anthropologist, Catherine Terrien, who actually records these stories. And, for example, finding a place to rent, impossible. And what's funny is that even the signs that are put, the signs for these migrants from south of the Sahara is no Africans in Morocco that is Africa. Right? So even that perception of they are Africans and we're not Africans. So it's really interesting to see here these nuances that we get, right, by looking at different records. And I think also something to maybe keep in mind is also the ability to speak. So depending on where you are, how much you can really say. So for example, here, in my discussion of Western Sahara as a Moroccan, I'm very empowered by Spanish as a co-author, right? Without, it would have been hard. So there are these things. So sometimes I'm actually more empowered outside of the context where maybe censorship would be much more consequential, right? So for example, speaking about Libya, right here, or research in Libya here, this is the kind of things I think we need. Is also these solidarities that actually create these spaces where you can have that expression. And on Spain, being not really the global north, actually, like for example, during the financial crisis, right, where there was the Brexit, Greece, right, was going to be out. So you had the PIGS, the Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, right, as the worst performing countries of Europe. I think, yes, there is, but it's still a European member state, right? But I think it's interesting to say because, for example, for the strategy of the state of Morocco, it was a bit like the low-hanging fruit, because the more important actor to actually gain recognition would be France, and France has it. And the reason is because France has been very, very careful on not angrying Algeria, because it is also a matter of conflict between the two neighbors, right? Is that Algeria is supporting the Polisario, and it has a strong stance, France, of actually not standing against Algeria, which Morocco has been trying to sort of change, but that's harder to do. And it is also a matter of power, which country is more powerful, right?
I just realized I missed to respond. I don't have much to respond, but when you were speaking, I just thought about the work of a Palestinian scholar, Professor Mahmoud Samad. She's a professor in urban planning in the University of Jerusalem, and she talks about the concept of healing urbanism, and talks about how, with global perspective, environment embodies the land and the culture and the presence of indigenous people. So if there is any act of reconstruction or restoration, it must go through the process of healing. The healing at the same time happens for the bodies, but also for the land. And these are interconnected. So when you talk about embodiment and subjectivity and environment, I think indigenous people show us, and indigenous scholars show us that there is interconnection between healing of the land and healing of the bodies, healing of the beds. Why Palestinians or Bosnians or indigenous people pay so much respect to the dead, to the body of the dead? I want to say this as my final words. I once was speaking to a Palestinian old man in a Palestinian camp in Lebanon. I asked him, what is your final wish in life? Maybe he was like 8-year-old or something, and said, to be buried in Palestine. I asked, why do you think geography matters to the dead? He responded, when you die in a place, when you're buried in a place, you become forever grounded there. And if you are a displaced person and you're grounded somewhere while displaced, the displacement becomes eternal.
So you forever remain spaced. I never thought about that displacement can continue in your life after this world. But you could see that being a displaced person, that land doesn't want to leave. He doesn't want his body to be buried there. That's why he's told his grandson, one day when Palestine is free, when they all go back, they should take the remains of him to his village.
You like that, bro?